Week 16's on its way. And here's 5 running backs that shouldn't be on their way to your starting lineup, and you should bench them. The first one is Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. Elliott, it's just been a lost season pretty much for him and the Cowboys. And last week, Elliott, he didn't even play with the calf injury. And to be honest, Tony Pollard this season, he's looked like the best running back in that Dallas Cowboy backfield. More explosiveness, better receiver out of the backfield. And Elliott, he just looks like he's worn down and slow. And with 4 out of 5 offensive linemen out for the rest of the season for the Cowboy team, that don't help as well. And plus his quarterback, Dak, who's been out since week 5. So Elliott this week, it's a tough matchup versus Philly, who gives up the 9th least amount of fantasy points to running backs. Elliott, if he does play, you bench him. And last time versus Philly, in Week 8, he had 63 rushing yards and only 1 catch for 10 yards. That's not going to get the job done. If he plays this week, I could see a similar type of performance, and that's a running back I want to put on the bench this week and can't trust. The second running back I've benched this week's James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Conner, he started off amazing this season, but the last few weeks, or months I should say, he really hasn't gotten the job done. The last time Conner reached double-digit fantasy points was week 11, and then he got the COVID, so he was out a couple weeks. And then in week 14 versus Buffalo, an abysmal 10 carries for 18 yards. Last week versus Cincinnati, another injury, so he was out. And this week, another tough matchup versus Pittsburgh Steelers backfield versus the Indianapolis Colts that give up the 13th least amount of fantasy points to running backs. Conner, like I said, he's only reached double-digit fantasy points twice since week 8. And this week I had him ranked 23rd or 24th, I believe, on my running back rankings. And I don't think he gets the job done here versus Indianapolis. So he's a running back I could see, and I should bench here. The third running back to bench this week's Gio Bernard of the Cincinnati Bengals. I know Bernard last week, he finally got things going and played well versus the Pittsburgh Steelers with 22 fantasy points, 83 yards, and rushing touchdown, and 1 catch for 14 yards and a touchdown. But Bernard, before that, he didn't reach double-digit fantasy points since week 8. So that was, I think, a fluky game. This week, I know he has a great matchup at Houston, who gives up the second most fantasy points to running backs. But I just can't trust Bernard this week in a big spot in a playoff game. And last week, he was probably on the bench 90% of the owners who own Bernard. So Gio Bernard, I can't trust him. He was inconsistent. It was one big game, and I would bench him. The fourth running back to bench is Damien Harris of the New England Patriots. Harris, we know he don't catch the ball out of the backfield, really. So if the Patriots are down in games, he's not really going to do much for your fantasy team. But he's a guy that still should be on your roster, and you could consider to start him if you really have no other options. And this week, Harris, we'll see if he plays. Last week, he missed it with the ankle injury, the game. But Harris, like I said, he only gets big yards when he gets a big workload. So right here, he don't catch the ball out of the backfield. And if he don't get a goal line touchdown, his stats are only going to be 6 or 7 fantasy points. And this week, in a pretty mediocre matchup versus Buffalo, he's a guy I would steer away from. And the fifth and final running back to bench this week's Chase Edmonds of the Arizona Cardinals. I know he's got a decent matchup versus the San Francisco 49ers, but Edmonds, he's been banged up most of the season with knee and ankle injuries, and his performances really haven't been great. I know last week he had 15 fantasy points, 47 yards rushing, 3 catches, 19 yards, and a touchdown, but before that, he failed to reach double digits since week 11. So I think, again, this week in a tough matchup versus San Francisco, Edmonds is a guy you can't trust. San Francisco, they give up the 4th least amount of fantasy points to running backs. And Edmonds, he didn't even crack my top 30 this week in the running back rankings. So that's 5 running backs I would bench here heading into week 16.